which is Redux-Toolkit. So, as I just said, Redux-Toolkit is the modern way of writing Redux code, and it's advised by the Redux team to now prefer Redux-Toolkit over classic Redux. That's because Redux-Toolkit is an opinionated approach that forces everyone to use best practices that the community has learned over the years. So basically, Redux-Toolkit took all these best practices and placed them into this new way of writing Redux. Now, does this mean that everything that you just learned is obsolete? Well, not at all. First, without these fundamentals, it's very hard to understand Redux-Toolkit, because it is built on top of classic Redux, of course. And second, both ways of writing Redux are 100% compatible with each other. So you can actually use classic Redux in one part of the app and Redux-Toolkit in another part, if that's what you want to do. Okay, so that all sounds great, but what's the big deal? So what are the actual advantages of Redux-Toolkit? Well, the biggest advantage is certainly that Redux-Toolkit allows us to write a lot less code to achieve the will look as if we were mutating the state object directly. And in my opinion, this is really the biggest advantage of using Redux-Toolkit, because if you have a pretty complex state object with nested objects and arrays, this can actually be a game changer in reducing complexity. Redux-Toolkit also automatically creates action creators from our reducers, and this can be quite helpful as, again, it helps us writing less code in the application. All right, and this should be enough of an introduction. And let's now start using Redux-Toolkit by converting our store to this new modern way of writing Redux. And remember how I said that Redux-Toolkit is 100% compatible with the regular Redux, which means that we can do this upgrade in a very gradual way. So we can start by only converting the store, but leaving our slices as they are. So that's really nice, again. So let's now start by, as always, installing this new tool by writing npm install, and now it is this @ symbol, so @redux.js, and then /toolkit. So this looks a bit different from what we're used to, but this is just because this @redux.js is basically a namespace in which the creator of this namespace then can publish multiple packages. All right, so let's wait for that to install, and there it is. And so remember how earlier we saw that this create store here is deprecated, and so now indeed we will use the configure store method instead. So let's import configure store right here from this package that we just installed. So this configure store function basically wraps around create store and adds a few functionalities to it. So basically, configure store does a lot of things automatically for us. So it automatically will combine our reducers, it will automatically add the thunk middleware, and it will even automatically set up the developer tools. So basically this part right here. So all of this will happen automatically, and then in the end, of course, our store is created and returned. Now let's actually first duplicate this file here, so that you can once again also keep basically the original older version. So here let's remove that again. And then inside our actual store.js, we now can get rid of all of this stuff. So we don't need any of this, and instead all we need is this configure store. Then we can also delete all of this, because all we need now is to call configure store, and then we pass it an object of options. And so here we can then specify the root reducer, basically. So simply the reducer property, and then again an object where we tell Redux-Toolkit about our two reducers. So let's again call it account, which is account reducer, and then also again customer. So customer reducer. And this is actually it. So the result of this will be our store. So then down there, we export that. And so now our application is working in exactly the same way as before. And so again, that's because we can upgrade gradually to Redux-Toolkit. So see how extremely easy it now is to set up a Redux application. All we have to do is to call configure store and pass it our two reducers. That's it. Nothing else we have to do. Now, then the part where we connect the React application with Redux works in the exact same way as before. So nothing changes with the React Redux package that we use on the React side. All right. So this simplification of setting up the store is already a huge win, but Redux-Toolkit can also help us with writing the state slices themselves. So here in the customer slice, we can now basically write this entire logic in a different way. And so let's see how in the next video. Let's now convert the account state slice into Redux-Toolkit. So let's close the customer slice and actually open up the account slice. Now, remember how we had already organized all our code here into this concept of slices. So we have the initial state, we have the reducer, and we also have the action creators down there in this file. And so now with Redux-Toolkit, this idea of slices actually really got baked into Redux itself. So we now have this function called createSlice, which we can import from Redux-Toolkit. So let's do that. So import create slice, just like this. And so this create slice function here gives us 3 big benefits. First of all, it will automatically create action creators from our reducers. Second, it makes writing these reducers a lot easier because we no longer need that switch statement, and also the default case is automatically handled. And third, we can actually mutate now our state inside reducers. So just as we have learned about previously when we first talked about Redux-Toolkit. Now, remember how behind the scenes, this will then use a library called immer, which will actually convert our logic back to immutable logic. So behind the scenes, Redux still requires this kind. So just as we have learned about previously when we first talked about Redux-Toolkit. Now, remember how behind, because we no longer need that switch statement, and also the default case is automatically handled. And third, we can actually mutate now our state inside reducers. So just as we have learned about previously when we first talked about Redux-Toolkit. Now, remember how behind the scenes, this will then use a library called immer, which will actually convert our logic back to immutable logic. So behind the scenes, Redux still requires this kind of logic right here, where we do not mutate the state, but we will now be able to convert this kind of logic here to a mutating logic. And from my experience, this last point is actually the biggest advantage of using Redux-Toolkit over what we have been doing before. About these other points, I believe that React-Toolkit actually forces us into a pattern that's a bit too opinionated, in my opinion. But, well, that's just the recommended way of using and learning Redux right now. And so, as I said in the beginning, let's now convert all of this. Now, actually, let's call this here again, just initial state. Okay, so this object we will actually keep, but the rest, let's now comment it out. And now here we get these errors, but that's no problem. Let's actually make this bigger now, and then split the window, so that we can see our old reducer here while we are working on the new ones. So this is pretty helpful for converting. Now in the future, you will then, of course, if you choose to use Redux-Toolkit, write this without converting. So you will not first write it this way, and then converting it to Redux-Toolkit. So you will just do what we do right now. And so that is to call our createSlice function, which then accepts, again, an object of options. And so this will then in the end return a slice, which we can call, in this case, the account slice. So what do we need to pass in here? Well, first of all, the name of the slice, which is account. Then, next up, the initial state. So it's a property called initial state, where we then need to pass in initial state. And so since in our case this has the same name, that's the same as writing this. And then finally, we need to pass in our reducers. So this time we will have basically multiple reducers, one reducer for each of these actions here. Okay, and so let's start writing on those. So the first one is called deposit, and it is a function that again receives the current state and the action. And notice how this deposit is basically the second part of the string that we had right here. So the name is account and then slash deposit, which is this one. And it is, so this deposit is also exactly the name of the action creator that we had here before, right? But anyway, let's now write our logic here. And for now, we will do it without the asynchronous data, so without the thunk that we had before. So what do we then do in the deposit? Well, all we do is to change the state. And so now, remember, we can write mutating logic. So we can do state.balance should become state.balance plus the action.payload. So the logic of receiving the current state and the action that was dispatched is still exactly the same way as in classic Redux. All right, so the only difference is that here we do no longer return the entire state now, and also we don't write it like this. So we don't create a new object where we then set the balance property. Instead, we basically mutate the balance property that lives on the state. And that's actually it for now, because remember, we will leave that here for later, so for the next lecture. So let's keep going with draw, again, state, and then the action. And now here we will have something very similar. So state.balance, we could even write it like this. So this is the same as state.balance minus action.payload. The same, let's do the same here. So plus equal like this. Next up, let's do the loan, state and action, and not withdraw, but request loan. So let's see what